Good day, everybody. Happy to be back with you all at my podcast, NGO Soul and Strategy. And today we are talking with Barney Tallack. And Barney, as many of you know, has worked in the NGO, social justice and not-for-profit sectors for nearly 30 years. He's held senior leadership and board member roles in a variety of international and UK organizations. He was the director of strategy and transformation at Oxfam in successive roles. He has a lot of background in supporting restructuring of organizations, restructuring of governance, as well in NGOs, as well as mergers and acquisitions. As the director of strategy, Barney, for Oxfam International, Barney ran the global strategy process, the last one before the current one that was initiated. And for 5 years, he also directed the global transformation and change work at Oxfam International. In the meantime, Barney has transitioned into independent consulting, and he has provided consultancy support to Concern Worldwide, Islamic Relief, Terre des Hommes, ACPAT, CBM International, and a range of other organizations. And Barney has also been a board member for numerous NGOs. And Barney and I go back a long way, and I'm really proud and happy about that. We collaborated in a couple of ways on change management issues when he was the director for change management and transformation at Oxfam. Barney was also a visiting Transnational NGO Initiative Fellow at Syracuse University when I led the TNGO initiative there. And he did a really interesting piece of applied research on how INGOs should think about and prepare for the legacies that they wish to leave behind. And we're going to return actually to that topic towards the end of this podcast. And Barney and I have collaborated on a book of which I'm a co-author together with George Mitchell and Hans-Peter Schmitz. This book will come out next month, actually, June 2020, with Oxford University Press. It is titled Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs. And Barney contributed to a couple of chapters, and he also wrote the afterword, which we were very grateful for. And we're also still thinking how we could share our joint knowledge on change management with INGO clients and the broader NGO community. So as I said, we go way back, and it's my absolute pleasure to talk today in this podcast. Barney and I will talk first for some time about change management, this very kind of nebulous topic that nonetheless is always very relevant, and probably as relevant now during our pandemic as it is at any point. And towards the end, I will also then bring it to the current moment in terms of the impacts and the implications of the pandemic on the financial forecast for NGOs and how CEOs and boards should respond to that. So we're going to devote a good chunk of time to that as well. So Barney, welcome to our podcast.
It's a pleasure, and as you say, we've collaborated many times on many things. So this is wonderful. Lovely.
It's a lovely conversation to kind of sum that up. So let's talk first about change management. Tell me a little bit about how you define that term, change management. It truly does sound rather nebulous, doesn't it? How do you define it in your work when you were a practitioner at Oxfam? And how do you define it now as a consultant working with INGO leaders?
So I think that I have positive and painful experiences in terms of either leading or supporting change management efforts, and they don't all work as well. So I think in the wider sense, it is really boards, leadership teams, other leaders who might be distributed all over the organization, understanding and their purpose, the purpose of the organization, the mission, and that, to stay relevant, you need to play a role. As I always say, you need to play a role that is wanted by the wider movement, by the wider social justice movement, or the wider environmental justice movement, or human rights movement, however you want to categorize it. So starting in that place that says, what is the role that is most useful and where we can serve the wider mission, not just our mission, but the wider mission. So starting at that place, then, so what's the mission, what's the purpose, what's our approach, and also what does that approach mean for how we are also internally organized. So if our approach is one of holding duty bearers to account, and enabling active citizens, how does that work in terms of our thinking? So at that top level, it's a huge umbrella, I know. You've got that. Some boards and leadership teams I've seen have wanted to go straight to the structure question. So they don't necessarily want to do the function piece. They want to go straight to form. So I think having that common understanding at the top, so not just vision but political will, you need that, creates an environment, and then it moves into you've got all the different elements, which is you're taking people on a journey where you don't know what the answer is, you don't know where the end point is. Right. Anyone who says it's a point A to point B journey don't listen to them. It's always building the ship while sailing, and cover the change management element covers. I say you want to go to structure, but it covers culture, it covers power, it covers dynamics and relationships which are often unequal, and people not realizing they're unequal, and it's not just what do we do around here and how do we do it, but also symbols and rituals and all those elements as well. So it's a huge thing. I would say there are probably no boundaries, but everything is interrelated. And actually the boundary between your organization and the outside of your organization is very porous indeed. And so also don't think about change management as a hermetically sealed internal thing. It's actually how you're changing, and coming back to that role piece, how are you changing in relationship to those other actors in the wider movement. So huge, not confined, and if anything, I'd say you start with the mindset and work out from there. How do you see the world? What is your vision for the world? How do you take all the resources and assets, people and otherwise, towards achieving that mission?
Right. And I will return to the one of the topics you mentioned, political will and power, a little later on in this episode. So personally, what have you found to be the most interesting or rewarding about the art and science of change management? And you have such a depth in that, both as a practitioner in INGOs and as a consultant. You said in the beginning, there are very rewarding aspects and a very painful one. Obviously, we'll get to both, but what was the most rewarding for you so far?
I think the most rewarding is working with formal and informal leaders who say, this is where we need to go. And doing that because they can see this is how the mission is going to be achieved more effectively. So especially ones who have been around maybe for a long time. So interestingly, when I did the Oxfam process, we did one of those lines where you have everybody standing in a line based on how long you've been with the organization. And the group of us who were at the end of the line, we'd all been there like 20 to 25 years, and we were the change team. And I thought, wow, that's quite interesting. And it turned out we were all the non-conformists within the organization we knew the organization, but we weren't as constrained maybe by their baggage.
That's really interesting.
I know, so that's rewarding. And when you work with leaders in other organizations who've got that passionate commitment, they've got the vision, the political will, but also are willing to be self-critical, not just personally, but about their organization. I think that's great, because that's when you get these leaps forward, rather than necessarily, we want to steer the super tanker and we'll do a course correction of 5 degrees. Those people who say, because the mission is so important, we need to do things better than we're doing at the moment, and that might mean really, really changing the organization. As you can imagine, the flip side.
Yeah.
The painful moments
Right.
are the opposite, where you're sat in a board meeting with a leadership team, and particularly in the families, where one or two member organisations just dig their heels in and say, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to change, and it just slows everything down for everyone. And that's when you really are in supertanker mode.
Right. I want to follow up with that in your mentioning, and I think you did that intentionally. You said working with formal but also informal leaders, and I've seen you being extremely thoughtful and intentional about that. Tell me a little bit more, as a change manager yourself, how do you involve and deploy informal leaders in a change process?
So I think every change process I've been involved in, you start off with there's an initial set of leaders that you're presented with as the leaders, and by the end of that process, those aren't the same set as the leaders as you end up with. So people do put their hands up. I mean, first and foremost, so you have to create that space where people can put their hands up. And then it's always dangerous to categorize, but broadly, I look at champions, positive resistors, and negative resistors. And champions are great, and that obviously you need the political will at the top. So if the top doesn't have that champion role, then not going anywhere. But actually, for me, the most interesting group are the positive resistors, because the reason they're resisting isn't to be difficult. The reason they're resisting is because they want the best answer. They want the most effective answer, and they can be anywhere in the organization. They are the people that other people listen to. And if person X, who might sit 4 levels down in the organization in a particular function, if they say, yeah, actually, this is where we should go, that just unlocks a whole lot of other people who then feel confident in this process must be doing something, because person X, who we've known, admired, respected, they're okay with it. So I think that's an interesting group for me. I think negative resistors are negative resistors, and you can put a lot of effort in. And frankly, they are, they're great people as individuals, working really hard, but are frightened of seeing that bigger picture. So I think that group of positive resistors, and enabling them to come into the space. So you can use all sorts of mechanisms, some of the more obvious ones about communication, and remembering communication isn't broadcast, remembering that communication is two ways, and letting them set up work groups to work on work streams. So when they come to you and say, I think we really need to worry about this or think about how this works, say, great, okay, create your own work stream and subgroup, and our job will be to try and interconnect that with everything else. That's so I think then you've got energy into the system, and no change process without energy. You can't, if you haven't got the energy being brought in, you can't create that yourself.
No. So what you said about positive resistors was really interesting. It made me think of also culture carriers, right? Some of these informal leaders are culture carriers. They're not just ambassadors, but they're culture carriers. There are often nodes in a network where people will go and people want to watch and people want to emulate, right? They have a high symbolic value in the organization. And I think some of the change processes that you and I have either observed or been a part of have probably underutilized the potential of these people. And it makes me also think of concepts around change management, like Leandro Herrero's work on viral change, for instance. Nice.
I would add one other thing on that, which is that across a big organization, and certainly a multi-member INGO, you have often these positive resistors feel like a lone voice. So, in their particular function, they have respect from people around them who know that they do things, but some of the things they've been saying maybe for years about, we need to stop doing this and start doing that, or the importance of this function is sometimes lost. And actually, when you've got a multi-member family, certainly, and you create a space for them to come together with their opposite numbers, if you like, their peers in other parts of what has been a quite siloed organization, that's wonderful. That you can see them then building the energy themselves and co-creating solutions which are even more effective because they fit the whole system, because they've got different positive resistors in the different parts, maybe different members, different affiliates, coming together and going, look, this is an answer. And that filters up, chief execs, program directors, finance directors do listen to these people.
Right, and so that they feel, not only do they feel less lonely, but they create and generate more energy, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, they start with a group therapy session, obviously. We'll say, this is the problem I'm having, and they all turn out to have the same. And I think in terms of working culture, I think what I've seen is, you can look at Hofstede and national cultures and language group cultures and all this. Functional culture seems to me to transcend all of those. You get the IT.
Can you just explain for our audiences what you mean by that?
So when I've convened people or created that space where they can self-organize, if you get, I don't know, all the MEL people talk more.
So that's
like
monitoring, evaluation and learning.
And the finance people will talk like finance people, and the people who are specialized in particular, bits of humanitarian will speak their own language, regardless of which member affiliate they come from, regardless of which language is their primary language, regardless of which part of the world they're in. They have that shared mindset, shared understanding, shared approach.
Right.
And that, I think, that's something to harness and to be aware of.
To harness. Yeah, I've noticed before that you really emphasize that. So we're already getting into the topic of what kind of frameworks, formal or informal, just frameworks in your mind, right? Like what you have always emphasized, this aspect of positive resistors and functional cultures, etc. As you know, there are tons and tons of frameworks and concepts around change management, right? It's a huge field, as you say. It's not just a huge process to be in or to be designing or helping shepherd, but it's also a huge field. It's been around for a couple of decades. It's very much private sector kind of informed initially. There are tons of them. So which of those frameworks and resources and tools that you have found to be out there, quote unquote, have you found to have most relevance to the NGO context?
So maybe I am either unprofessional or just too curious.
I suspect the latter.
Yes, to do this in a systemic way. So obviously there's different, as you say, different management consultancies. The big management consultancies. That there's lots of literature, and so on and so on. I always come back to it's people-centric. It's a people-centric approach. So
what do you mean by that?
So, I mean, we talked about positive resistors, we've talked about energy, we talk about people creating the answers that work for them. So I don't think that any change leader should be in the support role, the sort of transformation director, change director role, should be getting overly obsessed with doing the design work. Their job is to run a process that supports the right people to do the right bits of the design. So, you need to get, classic Cotter, you need to get that coalition, you need to articulate a vision, you need to communicate. So that's, Hofstede, Cotter's 8 steps, fantastic, always use that. But then for other parts, and I will go with what the context is with that organisation. So for me, context and history, and maybe this is because I'm a trained historian rather than a trained development professional, I think that is everything, because it frames the mindsets. So if you're doing a people-centric approach, you're looking at what the mindsets are, what people have in terms of power, or where they feel disempowered, what they have to gain or lose, etc., etc. So quite political, I suppose. So all of that, I think, and then the first two names I put on the team sheet. I don't know if that's a phrase that you use in the States.
No.
Here when you're playing a competitive sport, you have to do the team sheet before the match. You always say who are the first names on the team sheet.
I see.
And so for me, any organization I work with, I always say, I will help you with this, this, and this, but I need to have the communications person. I've got to have a communications person, and I've got to have the soft skills change person. So that's the person who understands the temperature of the organization, is constantly seeing when the ebbs and flows of anxiety, hope, etc., who are on top of the meta Kubler-Ross curve for the organization as a whole. So those two for me are critical, partly because they're not my strengths personally, but also you just can't get anywhere without those two.
Right. And just to explain
functions.
for our audience, you mentioned the Kubler-Ross. Tell me just quickly
what
that is.
So that's the grieving cycle, where people go through
Thank you.
denial, anger, then up to maybe a bit of hope, opportunity, and then they might go back down again and up again. But ultimately, they get to beyond opportunity, and okay, so let's manifest.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that.
But I think that's always been really important, and actually being quite explicit about that and doing Kubler-Ross training for all the staff, so they can be self-aware about
where they're at.
It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be really cross with what the leadership are doing, and then how do I engage as an individual? So all of those things, as I say, I am very interested in making sure those components are in place. The design is I think relatively easy compared to everybody going on that journey, or the people who want to go on that journey going on that journey. And that again comes back to probably you've got to be clear about the purpose and the role. You've got to have the leadership, but also you've got to be open to an emergent change process rather than a point A to point B. It's never a point A to point B. If you think you know what point B is very early on in the process, then it's almost certainly going to be the wrong point B, because you haven't got all that collective wisdom input from the people who do care and who know their areas. Don't know, that's how I see it.
Yeah, super interesting. I'm going to delve deeper on one more thing, and then we'll pivot to your recent financial paper. And that is about still a little deeper on this the role of politics and power in change, in organizational change processes, right? So one of the things that you and I have talked about before is there's this one framework that that I used to work when I was at Syracuse University, used to use rather by Bowman and Deal, these 4 frames where leaders can choose to choose their leadership behavior strategically depending on what context, the way they see the context. And one of those contexts is the political frame, which is this idea that the organization, amongst others, is also a jungle where people jockey for power and for resources and for access to the top leader, where there is a constant bargaining going on, right? Where we try to reduce our dependencies on others, etc. I'm curious how you see leaders' ability to use the political frame, and I mean now from the perspective of using the political frame to pursue the mission, not for petty, self-interested or petty perspectives. How competent have you seen change leaders use the political frame, you think?
So that is a good question, and I like the 4 frames approach, and I have to say I like the symbols and rituals corner. That's my favorite, I think, because that can be very transformational, because it just changes the language and the mindset. So where have I seen leaders do that well? So ones who understand servant leadership, I think, are the most effective. So you're acquiring power through your ability to support others to achieve. You're acquiring power through a recognition that you are someone that it is worth working with because you know what you're doing. But I think ultimately because people can see that connection between the values and the mission. So if you can demonstrate that what you're trying to do, particularly from a change or transformation perspective, is to achieve the mission and not to be about petty power, petty political power. If you're willing to give away, I mean, the more power you get, my personal learning is the more power you give away, the more you end up with. And just because there's more in the system, and so you are able, not more that you have at your disposal, but there is more power there created. So that's something that's basic sort of empowerment thinking, I know. So when I see people being servant leaders, that works really well. Where they are territorial, it's not good for them either. That's the irony, because you become at best it becomes at best a zero-sum game, as opposed to that giving away power, that servant leadership, that empowering. So yeah, so the negative is definitely when they are often unconsciously doing that. I'd say one other thing on the power piece, which is I have said many times, and doesn't always resonate with people, that because of the sector we work in, we forget how much our identity is wrapped up in the organization as well. So I used to be able to say, you know, I am the director of strategy for Oxfam International. 5 words that told everyone that who was a friend of mine or family, you know, that's what I care about. That's the sort of thing, even if they didn't know what strategy was.
Right.
Oh yeah, okay. So, you know, I get that. And I knew that I was emotionally invested with that, and I was very flattered when I got that particular title. It was just as useful, I think, in a way, as me hoovering the floors of shops when we opened Oxfam shops, a new shop. You know, I used to do the same thing, and I used to be proud of doing that as well. So I think that, but that emotionally invested with your personal identity, or being locked up with it. I think not enough people are aware of that or self-aware of that.
I so agree with you.
And it becomes an obstacle, because it comes to you can't lead that change if you're so connected. Which is also why Kubler-Ross is very useful in a way, because people aren't just grieving about the potential loss of their job; they're grieving about the potential loss of their identity with their friends and their families, etc. So
yes.
And one other thing, just on that, just, you know, I know it's not the power piece, but going back to the Kubler-Ross piece, is creating space for celebrating and grieving. I think is really important.
That's the culture piece, the symbolic frame, right? Yes.
And I think in that that links to the identity piece, because if people, what you never want to say to someone is, we need to go in this direction, and imply that everything that someone spent their last 20 years doing has been worthless.
Exactly.
You really have to get that, and especially with positive resistors and others, go, yeah, that was fantastic for that time.
Yeah.
We now need to go in this very different direction, and how do we build that? Anyway, that's an aside. But yeah, the power, where people are servant leaders, where they're conscious of it, where they understand their identity is wrapped up in it, and can manage that. I think those are all good things. Where people dig their heels in and want to play bargaining games, they disempower themselves as well as the system as a whole.
Yes, so and everybody loses. Yes, and we've seen plenty of examples of that too. It's so fantastic to talk to you, because I feel we so often resonate. I'm going to pivot now. So you have recently, we're in the middle of the pandemic, right? It is May 2020. You recently wrote a piece, an article, a brief, particularly I think focused on senior leaders and boards, right, of global North-founded NGOs, where you're doing some projections on the pretty dire financial situation that you expect will be the fallout from the pandemic for those NGOs, and how boards and senior teams should react strategically to that. Tell me a little bit about how you think that financial picture will evolve over the next couple of years as it relates to COVID, and what do you think CEOs and boards should do?
So let's take one of those and then come back on the other, because there's a lot
Fair
there.
enough.
So on the financial side, on the funding side, and I know I've been saying this for quite a few years now. I think we as NGOs, INGOs, we have some cognitive dissonance about how the funding and our existential challenges link up, and we pretend that they don't, and we are focused on the mission, and everything is program led, and as it should be, and community led, etc. And that's been okay in the years from certainly 09 through to about 16. So I've done this piece, but I've looked at the longitudinal trends for many of the big ones. There's a cohort of 7 for which I have the data, where the data is robust enough that you can do the trends, and you can see that 03 to 09 there was a slow and steady growth, and then there was a phase 09 to 16 when there was, despite the financial crisis, there was a rapid growth phase. And actually from 16 onwards, and this is all the families and sector as a whole, there was a flattening and then a decline already in 2018. So the trend hasn't been one of growth with more rapid, less rapid. It's been steady, rapid, flatten, decline. And in over the longer term, we always said, well, the next big emergency will then take the whole sector up, and you never come down as far as you were before that. But we've not had a 4-year period like we had from 15, 16 through to pre-COVID, where it just flattened and declined. That's a long period for a flattening and decline. So I think there's that is something that was evident pre-COVID, and there are a number of factors that go on there. One is institutional funding. Everyone's got very, not everyone, but many INGOs have got very dependent on institutional funding and from very few sources. So when that changes, that's one problem. Obviously the political and social environment is a lot more hostile than it was let's be clear about it, pre-November 2016 elections and pre the referendum in the UK, surfaced a political environment that was already there. We've seen greater attacks on INGOs in the sector because of what they stand for in that sense. So I think you've seen a few markets, dependency on particular institutional funders, focused in, there's basically 5 markets that most of the money comes from, and you're dependent on the public and the institutional funding in those places. On the public side, it's all saturated. It's really hard to grow without huge investment, and the rates of return are terrible compared to where they were 10, 20 years ago when I started. So you've got this nexus of problems which were already existing and had been for a number of years prior to COVID. And I think the pandemic, what it does is just accelerate the decline or the problems that we already saw. So indebted governments won't be having lots of spare money to put into international development. Their populaces will not be clamoring for politicians in their mandates. The mandates they're giving them won't be around 0.7. Only 5 of the DAC donors now give 0.7, where before it was a huge number. So we're in an environment where COVID, I think, has just accelerated, and as we come out of the other side, we'll have not necessarily just the nativism problem, but an understandable people saying, actually, we've got to rebuild our own countries, our own communities, etc. So I think there's that challenge. The political mandate is then lost, which will also hit the institutional funding. So the reason I say all of that is it was a pre-COVID problem, and I think the cognitive dissonance I was talking about was when times were good, people were seeing, institutional funding can grow the organisation. The bigger the organisation is an approximation for impact. Great. But over the last few years, the existential element, the need for the funding has changed people's interaction with it, not always intentionally.
That's a pretty depressing picture, but I fear it's a very realistic picture. So what, in a nutshell, what are your main recommendations to senior teams and boards?
I mean, there's it's a adage which is maybe slightly painful, but you don't waste a good crisis in terms of from a change perspective. So I think this is an opportunity to really make some decisions, make some strategic decisions. So we are in May, people are doing scenario planning, completely understand that's where you need to be. What's my cash flow going to be for the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, completely understand that. But I think this is the moment to say, what do we need to be in order to achieve the mission for the future? And I think there's 4 dimensions for me for that. And the first one is something I touched on earlier: role and relevance. Now is the time to really understand from your wider set of stakeholders, your critical friends across the piece, what's the most useful role that you can play, where are you relevant, and being honest about your strengths and your weaknesses, not the ones necessarily that you hold up as strengths. Some of the things where you say, oh, we're the unique expert on X or Y, really critique that. So I think role, relevance, and getting those critical friends in. So that's one area. Leading from that, following that is focus. You've got to say, this is the time where we take the things that we aren't expert at, and now that we've done the exercise, we know we're not expert at, drop those, be way more focused on the thematic areas, the geographies, the program approaches, etc. So the mandate piece, can we do all 3? Many organizations try to do humanitarian, long-term development and advocacy. Can you really do all 3? Are you skilled? And can you do it across multiple geographies? And can you really do it over multiple themes and sub-themes? So focus. A very simple third one, which is around just projections, financial projections for the future. So I know a number of organizations were either mid-process or towards the end of the process, and they were setting financial targets which showed growth over a 5-year, 10-year. Don't set growth targets. Almost certainly the money's not going to be there, and actually really do think about whether being smaller is actually going to achieve more impact if you're doing the things that you are actually expert in, where your role and relevance works. So that's a third one. Although do protect the public awareness and grassroots community connectedness budgets. And then the fourth is thinking about members and growth, and thinking about it maybe in a different way. So revisit your rationale for growing your members of the organisation, your national members. Is that really realistic? And combined with that is, what is your organisation's response to localisation? Because I think a number of the Northern NGOs have seen a route to growth being actually create southern members. I as someone who passionately believes in global balance, I can see that as a mechanism, but that's not necessarily what southern civil society is telling us it wants.
It doesn't.
No, it really doesn't. So I think now is the time to revisit those ideas, and maybe there's different ways of achieving it. Maybe you have fewer northern members by merging some of those ones that are struggling within your family, maybe merging with another organization, maybe saying, look, we're good at this, what is it that we need to acquire opportunistically, because some organizations are going to go to the wall, we know that, and how do I acquire that to make our organization stronger in the area that we can work in. So 4 things: role of relevance, focus, financial reality, and then growth, members. What is it you really want your organisation,
combined,
your family to look like? So that's that would be my suggestion.
Wow, that was a wide-ranging explanation on the financial projections and on responses that we, especially as leaders, can make to that. So I will definitely in the show notes put a link to your email, because you've already given me permission for that. You're also going to write a guest blog on my Five Oaks consulting site, where people can get this summary, because I really would like a lot of people to be able to read that. Barney, we have to bring this episode to a close. It's been such a delight to talk to you, although the last topic is not exactly delightful. It's a very, it's a pretty tough picture. And yeah, I just think that it's better to be honest to ourselves at this moment, because I think that there is a crucial role for many of us, but we have to come to terms with some realities where indeed this crisis can be an opportunity for changes that maybe our sector and some of us individually as NGOs were overdue for anyway.
Yeah.
So with that, let me finish by asking, where can people find out more about you?
So if you look on my LinkedIn, you'll find me on there. The advantage of having a unique name is there's only one Barney Tallack on LinkedIn.
Yes.
Likewise, people feel free to email me. So barneytallack@gmail.com.
I'll put it in the show notes, both of these.
Thank you very much. No, that's good. So yeah, you can track me down fairly easily. There's only one Barney Tallack, so that's handy.
We will put all of it in show notes. Yeah. And so I want to thank you, Barney, again for this such a stimulating conversation. And I want to thank all of you listeners today for listening. This is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.